The bedside alarm clock shrieked at 4:30 in the morning. But Jolene was already awake, her eyes fixed on the final foreclosure notice taped to the front door like a death warrant. Outside, the Alabama heat had turned the earth into a graveyard of jagged red fissures that swallowed the last of the clover. As she stepped into the yard, the rhythmic hiss of the milking machines was suddenly drowned out by the crunch of gravel under the tires of a black SUV. A man in a suit as sharp as a blade stepped out, spreading a corporate map across the hood of his car and pointing to her house with a smile that never reached his eyes. Under the cover of a moonless night, the farm went silent. Not the silence of sleep, but the suffocating quiet of a dying engine. Jolene sprinted toward the well, her boots sinking into dust that tasted like ash, only to find the irrigation line severed and the pump house a twisted wreck of smoldering metal. A few feet away, her prize cattle lay heaving in the dirt, their eyes rolling back as a strange, bitter foam bubbled from their muzzles. She clutched a heavy wooden shovel, her knuckles white and bleeding, as she stared into the darkness of the tree line. The 2-week countdown had begun, and the first shot hadn't just been fired, it had already hit home. The bedside alarm clock shrieked at 4:30 in the morning, a jagged sound that tore through the heavy silence of the bedroom like a blade through silk. Jolene Harper didn't linger in the warmth. She threw back the wool blanket with a sharp motion, exposing her skin to the pre-dawn chill. Her bare feet met the floorboards, and the wood groaned beneath her weight, a familiar, weary protest that echoed in her own joints. She dressed in the dark, pulling on a canvas jacket stained with the grease and salt of 1,000 chores. Outside, the air in the milking parlor hung thick with the scent of fermented hay and the sweet, heavy musk of warm milk. Jolene stepped into the blue shadows of the yard, where a thin layer of frost silvered the galvanized metal of the buckets, making them glint like fallen stars. Her fingers, mapped with calluses and scarred by years of unyielding labor, wrapped around the cold steel taps of the milking machines. Her back muscles throbbed with every rhythmic bend, a dull ache that punctuated the morning. Inside the barn, the rhythmic hiss of steam from the cow's nostrils mingled with Jolene's own ragged breathing, the sounds echoing against the rafters of the hollow, cavernous space. Jolene stood atop the rise of the hill as the sun began its ascent, squinting against the first shards of a light that felt more like a threat than a promise. Beneath the soles of her work boots, the ground didn't give way with the lush spring of healthy clover. Instead, it shattered. Brittle gray stalks of grass, scorched by a relentless Alabama heat, turned to fine powder under her tread. The horizon shimmered, a distorted mirage of heat that made the distant tree line dance and buckle, while the earth beneath her feet yawned open in deep, jagged fissures. These cracks looked like unhealed wounds in the red clay. She walked toward the granary, her heart sinking before she even reached the doors. She struck the wooden slats of the empty bin with her palm, the hollow thud confirming her fears. Only a few shriveled grains skittered across the floor, a meager offering that drew a flock of starving sparrows from the rafters. Jolene's gaze drifted to the cattle. Their ribs stood out in sharp relief beneath their hides, the skin stretched tight over bone. A sudden gust of dry wind whipped a handful of grit into her face, stinging her eyes and coating her tongue with the taste of failure. It was the silent triumph of the drought, a slow-motion strangulation of the Harper legacy. In the kitchen, Jolene set the plates down with a deliberate clatter, a desperate attempt to drown out the oppressive silence of the house. She cracked the last 3 eggs against the rim of a heavy cast-iron skillet, her eyes fixed on the yellow yolks, ensuring not a single fragment of shell marred the meager meal. When Benjamin and Emily burst into the room, their energy a sharp contrast to the stillness of the morning. Jolene forced her facial muscles into a wide, artificial smile. Her hands betrayed her, shaking with a fine tremor as she poured the remains of the orange juice, heavily diluted with water to make it stretch. She kept her voice light, tossing out jokes about the weather and the games they would play later, acting the part of the mother who had everything under control. Yet, inside, a cold knot of terror tightened in her throat. She couldn't stop her eyes from drifting toward the stack of newspapers on the counter, beneath which lay the mounting pile of unpaid utility bills and the final notices she had hidden away like shameful secrets. Jolene trudged down the long driveway toward the mailbox, her boots sinking into the fine, red powder of the road. Among the glossy circulars and colorful advertisements for things she could no longer afford, she spotted a stark white envelope. It bore a bold, red stamp that screamed urgent. Her pulse quickened. Her fingers tore at the paper, leaving jagged, uneven edges in her haste. Her eyes raced across the lines of cold, legal prose, snagging on words that felt like physical blows. Delinquency, penalties, foreclosure. The text began to swim, the black ink blurring into a dark, impenetrable smear. She clutched the official letter to her chest, the paper crinkling sharply under her hand, a sound like dry leaves. A sudden gust of wind caught the envelope, ripping it from her grasp and sending it tumbling into the dust. But Jolene didn't move to chase it. She remained motionless, silhouetted against the setting sun, feeling the very ground beneath her feet dissolve under the crushing weight of the bank's ultimatum. Jolene adjusted the collar of her only decent blazer, her fingers fumbling with the fabric before she faced the dark oak door of the bank manager's office. The air inside smelled of expensive cologne and polished leather, a scent that felt like an insult to the dust under her fingernails. Mr. Smith, the manager, didn't bother to look up from his monitor as she crossed the plush carpet. She laid a folder on his desk, her hands trembling as she presented a carefully drafted plan to save the farm. She laced her fingers together, squeezing them into a tight knot to hide the shaking, and began to speak of family history, of the generations of Harpers who had bled into that soil, and the temporary nature of this dry spell. Mr. Smith cut her off with a brief, dismissive wave of a manicured hand. His voice was a flat, metallic drone as he recited phrases about unfeasible risks and final board decisions. Jolene saw her own reflection in the polished mahogany of his desk. A pale, ghost-like version of a woman whose world had just been erased by the stroke of a fountain pen. A black SUV pulled into the farm's gravel drive, kicking up a plume of dust that settled like ash on Jolene's clothes. A man stepped out, his gray suit perfectly pressed, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of the sagging barn. He handed her a business card embossed with the logo of Zenith AgsCorp. Without waiting for an invitation, the representative spread a map of the Harper lands across the hood of his vehicle, his finger tracing the boundaries she knew by heart. He named a figure for the buyout, a number that made the world tilt on its axis. It was an insult. The sum would barely cover the interest on her debt, leaving her and the children on the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Jolene stared at the man's glossy Italian shoes, which looked like alien artifacts on the parched Alabama earth. The man smiled, a thin, predatory expression, and Jolene felt something shift inside her. The despair and the suffocating weakness were suddenly crowded out by a cold, white-hot flash of fury. Jolene took a sharp step forward, closing the distance between herself and the corporate shark until she could smell the peppermint on his breath. She raised her hand, pointing a steady finger toward the road where the farm's gravel met the county highway. Her voice didn't waver. It came out low and hard, a sound like grinding stones, as she ordered him to get off her property. The man started to object, his mouth opening to offer some rehearsed platitude. But she cut him off. She reminded him whose blood and sweat had nourished this land for 30 years. She thought of James's calloused hands, the way he would run his fingers through the soil with a reverence that bordered on the religious. When the guest hesitated, Jolene reached for a heavy wooden shovel leaning against the porch rail. She didn't swing it, but the way she gripped the handle made the man recoil. He backed toward his SUV, his eyes wide as they met Jolene's unyielding, incinerating stare. The Zenith representative gripped the door handle of his vehicle, but he paused, glancing back over his shoulder at Jolene. The mask of polite professionalism had slipped, replaced by a sneer of pure contempt. He spat out a final warning, telling her that her stubbornness would turn into a total catastrophe within the month. He promised her that soon enough, she would be begging for half of what he had offered today. Especially when the sheriff arrived to start hauling her furniture onto the lawn. Jolene stood her ground, her jaw set so tight it ached, her fists clenched until her nails bit into the meat of her palms. The roar of the powerful engine drowned out the man's parting insults. She watched the SUV disappear into a cloud of its own dust, feeling the invisible noose around her family's neck tighten another notch. But her heart remained a cold, hard stone. The following morning, Jolene found a brightly colored official form taped to her front door, the state seal mocking her in the early light. The word eviction was printed in a typeface so large it seemed to sear itself into her retinas. The text informed her of the date. Exactly 14 days. 2 weeks to erase a lifetime. She ran her fingertips over the rough grain of the paper, the cold metal of the door hinges feeling like ice against her skin. A neighbor's truck slowed as it passed the gate, the driver pointedly looking at the horizon to avoid her gaze. Jolene felt their pity like a physical weight, a suffocating shroud. From inside the house, the sounds of Benjamin and Emily playing reached her ears, their laughter a sharp contrast to the silence of her heart. She ripped the notice from the wood, crumpling it into a tight ball in her fist. She understood then that the hourglass had been flipped, and the sand was screaming as it fell. In James's old study, Jolene clicked on the desk lamp, its yellow glow casting long, distorted shadows across the mountains of paperwork. She spent hours sifting through yellowed land deeds, old tax receipts, and thick, intimidating legal manuals. The scent of aging paper and the faint, lingering aroma of James's pipe tobacco clung to the heavy curtains. She used a pencil to underline paragraphs concerning farmers' rights and procedural errors in foreclosure filings. The clock on the wall struck midnight, the chimes echoing through the quiet house, but she didn't stop. Her eyes burned and watered from the strain of the fine print. But amidst the chaos of figures and jargon, she began to see it. A tiny, overlooked loophole. A single thread she could pull to unravel the bank's mechanical cruelty. Jolene gathered Benjamin and Emily in the living room, guiding them to the worn velvet sofa. She took their small hands in hers, feeling the warmth of their skin and the absolute trust in their eyes. Looking directly at her son and daughter, she told them that no one was going to make them pack their bags. Her voice remained steady, a bedrock of certainty, as she promised to protect their bedrooms, their toys, and the memories of their father that lived in every corner of the house. Emily pressed her face into Jolene's shoulder, while Benjamin nodded with a gravity that went beyond his 12 years, seeing the steel trap resolve in his mother's eyes. In that moment, Jolene ceased to be merely a farmer struggling with debt. She became a sentinel, a warrior turning her home into a fortress against a world that wanted to take everything. The next morning, Jolene cleared the kitchen table, laying out fresh sheets of paper and sharpening her pencils until the points were lethal. She began to draw a complex web of connections between the local bank and Zenith AgCorp. Noting the overlaps in board members and the suspicious timing of the foreclosure, she compiled a list of other local farmers who had been squeezed out, her movements filled with a cold, calculated precision. There were no more tears. No more silent pleas for mercy. When her first call to a legal aid office went to voicemail, she didn't sigh. She simply hit redial. She pulled on her heavy work gloves and stepped out onto the porch, her eyes scanning the road. She was ready for whatever enemy decided to cross the threshold of her home. In the dead of night, Jolene bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sudden absence of sound was deafening. The old refrigerator in the kitchen had stopped its rhythmic vibration, and the slight, comforting rattle of the window frames from the irrigation pump had vanished, replaced by an echoing, hollow silence. She ran barefoot to the bathroom and twisted the brass faucet to its limit. Instead of water, the pipes gave a dry, hacking cough, and a cloud of rust-colored dust puffed into the sink. She pressed her ear against the cold plaster of the wall, straining to hear even the smallest gurgle in the plumbing. But the house remained mute, as if its very heart had been cut out. A stray draft stirred the curtains, while Jolene stood in the dark, realizing the pulse of the farm had flatlined. Jolene sprinted across the pasture, her boots catching on hidden clumps of dry grass as she navigated by the frantic beam of her flashlight. The light finally landed on the skeletal frame of the pump station. The main power cable, thick as a man's thumb, hung uselessly from the pole, its copper veins glinting where they had been jaggedly severed. As she stepped closer, her boots didn't hit water, but something thick and foul-smelling. The flashlight beam swept over the control panel. It was completely obscured by a fresh, glossy layer of black paint. The sharp, chemical stench of solvent hit her, making her stomach churn. She ran a finger over the dial, and the black sludge clung to her skin in long, viscous threads, hiding the pressure gauges behind a mask of deliberate sabotage. Jolene put her shoulder against a buckled steel support beam, her boots sliding in the grit as she tried to shove the pump's housing back into alignment. The metal screeched against the concrete base, a sound like a wounded animal. Suddenly, a rusted bolt sheared off with a high-pitched whine, and the entire structure, weighing several hundred pounds, began to tilt directly toward her. At the last possible second, Jolene clawed at the gravel, throwing her body backward with a desperate heave. The heavy steel slammed into the earth barely an inch from her hip, sending a spray of dry dirt and sparks into the air. She lay on her back, lungs burning as she gasped for air, her knees shaking uncontrollably. The shadow of the collapsed machinery fell over her like a tombstone. The first rays of dawn turned the interior of the cow barn a bruised, bloody red. But the usual chorus of impatient lowing was absent. The cows stood in a terrifying stillness, their heads bowed low to their hooves. They didn't even turn when Jolene entered. She walked to her favorite, Bessie, and touched the animal's muzzle. It was dry and scorching hot. A raspy, whistling sound escaped the cow's nostrils, and its sides heaved with a visible, agonizing effort, as if every breath was being drawn through broken glass. Jolene checked the troughs. The grain was untouched, but scattered through it were strange, gray granules that didn't belong. Her heart skipped a beat as she noticed a fine, white foam bubbling at the corners of the animals' mouths. Dr. Miller pulled off his stained latex gloves with a sharp snap and sighed, looking at Jolene over the rims of his spectacles. The air in the barn was heavy with the scent of medicine and the metallic tang of sickness. He used a pair of forceps to point at an open bag of feed, where bluish specks of technical-grade phosphide stood out against the gold grain. Jolene felt herself turn to stone as the veterinarian spoke the word. Poison. This wasn't a natural blight or a bad batch of hay. It was concentrated chemistry designed for vermin. She clenched her fists, listening to the grim report on the liver damage sustained by the herd. Every word out of the doctor's mouth sounded like a death warrant that someone had cold-bloodedly served in the dark. Jolene shoved through the glass doors of the bank, ignoring the protests of the receptionist. Mr. Smith sat behind his mahogany desk, adjusting his silk tie with an air of practiced indifference. Before she could even open her mouth to speak of the sabotage, he slid a document across the desk. It was printed on heavy, watermarked paper. Jolene saw the bold text informing her of a reevaluation of terms due to the increased risk of collateral loss. The 14-day grace period had been struck through with a heavy black line. A new date was written above it. 72 hours. Mr. Smith tapped a gold-plated pen against the paper, his gaze moving right through her. The sound of her own blood thundered in her ears, and the figures on the page looked like black vultures circling the remains of her life. Jolene slammed her truck to a halt at the gates of the neighboring ranch, where Frank was hunched over a tractor engine. She shouted over the fence, her voice raw as she begged him to loan her just one water buffalo to keep her herd alive. Frank froze, his shoulders hunching, but he refused to turn around. She could see his knuckles turning white as he gripped a wrench. Without a word, he reached for a heavy chain, and the iron gate swung shut with a violent, metallic clang. The sound of the bolt sliding home was as final as a gunshot. Jolene hammered her palm against the cold metal, screaming for him to remember their years of friendship. But she only saw his retreating back. The fear of Zenith had poisoned the well of the community, leaving her stranded and alone. On the drive back, Jolene's old pickup screeched to a halt before a wall of yellow iron. A massive grader had been parked diagonally across the dirt road, its blade buried in the earth to churn up the gravel and subsoil. A man in an orange safety vest leaned against a truck, chewing on a piece of straw. He pointed lazily to a temporary road closed sign, claiming the ground had become unstable and required immediate, indefinite repair. Jolene knew it was a lie. She had driven over this exact spot an hour ago without a bump. Cut off from the town and any hope of supplies, she stared at the barrier of heavy machinery. The acrid exhaust of the idling construction equipment swirled around her, a thick, choking veil that separated her farm from the rest of the world. Jolene opened her mailbox, bracing for more bills, but found only a single white envelope without a stamp or return address. Inside was a piece of notebook paper with jagged, blocky letters. Take Ben and Sarah. Leave now, or tomorrow you'll be looking at a pile of ash, she read. The ink seemed to vibrate on the page. The paper smelled of cheap tobacco and gasoline. She spun around, her eyes scanning the shimmering heat haze over the road, feeling the weight of a hidden observer's gaze. The threat of fire hung in the dry, stagnant air, where a single spark would turn her parched pastures into an inferno. She tucked the note into her pocket, the fear for her children piercing her heart like a needle of ice. As twilight bled into a bruised purple over the valley, Jolene stepped onto the porch, drawn by the low rumble of heavy engines. At the far boundary of her property, a line of trucks bearing the Zenith logo had pulled over. With a series of heavy thuds, the tailgates dropped, and workers began tossing bales of fresh, fragrant alfalfa onto the ground. They were stacking the hay in neat, golden rows on the neighbor's field, barely 100 yards from Jolene's starving cattle. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sweet clover and rich earth to her, a cruel taunt to her dying herd. It was a parade of abundance, a deliberate display of corporate power meant to highlight her own ruin. The headlights of the Zenith trucks sliced through the dark, making her farm look like a tiny, besieged island. Jolene walked into the center of the empty corral, the ground beneath her boots a hard, lifeless crust. She dropped to her knees, not caring about the dust that coated her clothes. She scooped up a handful of the tainted feed, the gray poison granules mixed with the grain, and squeezed it until the sharp edges of the corn husks sliced into her palm. Blood welled up, mixing with the chemicals to turn the mixture a muddy, dark red. She threw her head back toward the indifferent Alabama sky and let out a raw, ragged scream that was swallowed by the silence of the dead pastures. A pulse of helpless rage throbbed in her temples, eventually fading into a hollow, ringing void. She let the poisoned grain spill through her fingers like the ashes of her life. Jolene turned back toward the house and saw two pale shapes in the kitchen window, the faces of Benjamin and Emily. They were pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with a quiet, observant terror, their small hands frozen against the frame. In the dim light of the kitchen lamp, they looked like fragile ghosts haunting their own home. Jolene realized then that in 72 hours, these children would be standing on the shoulder of the highway, watching the only world they had ever known be locked away behind a corporate chain-link fence. The weight of that realization was a physical blow, leaving her breathless in the dark. Jolene stood her ground on the top step of the porch, her legs braced wide to form a human barrier before the heavy oak door. The court-appointed bailiff, wearing a sweat-stained uniform vest, wouldn't meet her eyes as his fingers moved with practiced efficiency, unrolling a spool of bright yellow tape. The air was filled with the sharp, rhythmic snap of plastic being torn as the tape, emblazoned with "Property of the Bank," was stretched across the door handle. Inside the house, she could hear the mechanical click of a camera shutter. A second man was moving through the living room, the flashes of his camera illuminating the dining table and the antique sideboard, where gray inventory tags were being slapped onto the wood. Jolene gripped the porch railing so hard she felt the splinters bite into her skin, watching as these strangers reduced her family's history to a cold, numbered list of assets. Jolene descended into the crawlspace beneath the house, where the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and old lime. She shoved aside a heavy wooden rack of empty canning jars, revealing a loose floorboard. Her knees ground into the cold concrete as she reached into the dark, pulling out a dented tin cracker box. The metal was pitted with rust, and the lid gave a mournful, screeching groan as she forced it open. Inside were thick rolls of small bills, held together by brittle rubber bands. The money she had scraped together over years of skipped meals and mended clothes, all for the children's education. She clutched the cold metal box to her chest, feeling the last of her safety net transform into a desperate bet in a game where the house held all the cards. In the deep cellar, hidden behind a false wall of rough-hewn sandstone, Jolene pulled back the linen shrouds from the heavy rounds of cheese. The air in this secret chamber was intoxicating, filled with the dense, nutty aroma of aged milk. She began to pack the golden discs into wooden crates, layering them carefully with dry straw. Every round was a testament to months of patient silence and the precise, cool temperatures she had guarded against the summer heat and the corporate saboteurs. Her muscles burned and strained as she carried the heavy crates out to the truck. The pickup's suspension groaned under the weight of the high-end product, the only thing she had left that might be worth enough to buy her way out of the grave. Jolene floored the accelerator as she saw the roadblock of orange cones and idling Riders ahead. The workers shouted and waved their arms, but she didn't slow down. She yanked the steering wheel to the right. The tires of the pickup chewed into the soft, treacherous lip of a ravine, sending plumes of red gravel flying. The truck tilted at a dangerous angle, the crates in the back slamming against the sideboards with a series of heavy thuds, while wild brush scraped against the windshield like fingernails. She white-knuckled the wheel, the truck bucking over hidden rocks and stumps. The engine let out a high-pitched, straining whine as it clawed up the steep embankment, finally bursting through the brush and onto the highway, leaving the blockade far behind. The rearview mirror suddenly filled with the aggressive chrome grills of two black SUVs. Jolene heard the scream of tires as the Zenith pursuers swerved to flank her, pinning her pickup between them. The window of the vehicle to her left slid down, and she caught a glimpse of a driver whose face was a mask of cold indifference behind dark glasses. The SUV on the right lunged toward her, its fender slamming into her truck with a jarring impact. The sound of grinding metal filled the cabin, and sparks sprayed across the dry grass at the edge of the road. Her hands vibrated with the force of the blows, the steering wheel trying to kick out of her grip. The corporate vehicles were closing in like a vice, trying to force her off the road and down a steep, rocky slope. Ahead loomed the concrete pillars of a narrow bridge over a dry creek bed. Jolene saw the SUVs accelerate, their engines roaring as they prepared to pin her against the concrete rail. At the very last second, she slammed on the brakes, the nose of the pickup diving toward the asphalt. The Zenith vehicles, caught by their own momentum, shot past her. She immediately cut the wheel into the gap behind them, her tires smoking as she veered onto the bridge. The sound of a frantic metal-on-metal collision echoed behind her as the two SUVs clipped each other. Jolene shifted gears, her engine screaming as she pushed the old truck to its limit, racing toward the horizon where the flags of the state fairgrounds were just beginning to appear through the heat haze. Jolene sprinted up the wide concrete steps of the administration building just as the heavy oak doors began to swing shut for the day. She shoved her arm into the closing gap, the cold metal of the frame biting into her forearm. The interior smelled of floor wax and old ledgers. The clerk behind the counter was already reaching for the closed sign, but Jolene slammed her folder and a stack of receipts onto the wood with a deafening thud. Her breath came in ragged, whistling gasps, and sweat streaked with road dust ran down her face. The clerk looked at the clock and frowned, but Jolene didn't budge. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, until a wet blue registration stamp finally bloomed on her grant application. Inside the darkened exhibition hall, the silence was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic crack of breaking plastic. Shadows moved with practiced efficiency around the booth labeled Harper Farm. Jolene wasn't there to see the Zenith mercenaries pry open the locks on her refrigerated displays, but the aftermath of their work was a nightmare. They uncapped cans of thick, industrial blue paint and poured it over the golden rounds of cheese, the liquid staining the rinds and ruining months of work in seconds. One of the men used a crowbar to rip open a hidden compartment beneath the counter, snatching a leather folio filled with financial records and original licenses. They vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but the stinging smell of chemicals and a ruined display. At dawn, Jolene stood at the entrance to her pavilion, her feet refusing to move. The floor was a minefield of shattered glass that crunched under her boots. She watched the blue paint drip slowly from the ruined cheese, forming sticky sapphire pools on the floor. She lunged toward the counter, her hands frantically searching the space beneath the tabletop. The leather bag was gone. All her original tax filings, her herd certifications, and her land titles had vanished. Without those documents, she wasn't a business owner. She was just a trespasser with a pile of trash. She sifted through the scattered promotional flyers, her hands shaking. But the proof she needed to survive was nowhere to be found. A group of judges in charcoal gray suits came to a halt before her devastated booth. Jolene took a step forward, her mouth opening to explain, but the words died in her throat. Suddenly, the Zenith representative appeared at the judge's elbows, his white shirt gleaming in the morning light. He gestured toward the blue-stained cheese and the broken glass with a look of mock pity, speaking loudly about the unfortunate lack of professionalism inherent in small-scale operations. The judges frowned, their eyes moving from the mess to Jolene's dusty clothes. When she tried to mention the stolen documents, the representative laughed, a sharp, barking sound, dismissing her claim as a desperate excuse for a lack of proper licensing. Jolene watched as the lead judge made a sharp, final notation in his ledger, effectively erasing her from the competition. On the fairground's central stage, the house lights flared to life, illuminating a massive gold trophy and a sealed envelope containing the grant check. Jolene stood in the shadow of a support pillar, watching as a tall man in a brand-new, uncreased work shirt stepped into the spotlight. He was a puppet, a face for a Zenith-owned shell company whose hands had never touched a plow. The crowd erupted into applause as the announcer named the winner, citing unprecedented efficiency that had been manufactured in a corporate boardroom. Jolene felt a cold snap deep inside her chest. As she watched the traitor beam at the cameras, she felt the final, crushing weight of total powerlessness. The honest fight was over, and the people who bought the truth had won. Jolene sank to her knees on the stained floor of the pavilion. Around her lay the splintered remains of her wooden crates and empty folders that were now worth less than the dust they sat in. She gripped the edge of the display table, her fingers coming away slick with blue paint. Outside, the sky over Montgomery erupted in a series of celebratory fireworks, the booms echoing through the hall. The colorful flashes reflected in the pools of paint and in Jolene's own hollow eyes. The roar of the crowd sounded like a jeering laugh. In the silence of her defeat, she realized she had nothing left. No farm, no legacy to leave the children, only the scent of ruined cheese and the cold, hard floor beneath her. Jolene hauled herself into the cab of her battered pickup, her breath coming in jagged hitches. In a burst of frustration, she slammed her fist against the passenger seat, the impact vibrating through her arm. Beneath the worn fabric, she felt something hard and round shift. She reached into the narrow gap between the seat and the frame, her fingers brushing against something wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it out, a single small round of cheese that had rolled into the crevice during the high-speed chase. Right behind it, a black plastic object clattered onto the floor mat. She picked it up. It was James's old digital recorder. She pressed the play button with a trembling thumb. Through a haze of static, the voice of the Zenith representative filled the cab, his tone smug as he detailed exactly how his men would set fire to the Harper hay shed. Jolene used her shoulder to shove open the double doors of the VIP banquet hall, the heavy wood thudding against the walls. The room was a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns, smelling of roasted meat and expensive wine. 5 judges froze, their forks halfway to their mouths, as they stared at the woman in the doorway. Jolene was a specter of the working class, her face smeared with road dust and her jacket stained with blue paint. She strode across the plush carpet, her boots leaving muddy prints on the silk rug. With a heavy, resonant thud, she dropped the golden round of cheese onto the center of the head table, right between a crystal decanter and a silver platter. She leaned over the table, her eyes locking onto the lead judge, and demanded their attention in a voice that brooked no refusal. Jolene reached for the leather sheath at her belt, pulling out a folding knife with a handle of weathered bone. The blade clicked into place, and she drove it into the heart of the cheese, the metal slicing through the rind with a clean, satisfying sound. As she split the round, the air in the banquet hall was suddenly transformed. A dense, complex aroma exploded into the room. Scents of wild Alabama clover, sun-warmed earth, and the sharp, clean tang of high meadow herbs. The judges leaned in instinctively, their nostrils flaring as they took in a scent that was the literal distillation of the land they were supposed to protect. Jolene slid the slices toward them, the amber oil of the aged milk glistening on the surface like honey. While the judges were still processing the flavor of the cheese, Jolene held the recorder aloft and hit the play button. The voice of the Zenith man filled the hall, amplified by the high ceilings and the sudden, shocked silence of the guests. The recording was a confession of corporate warfare. The bribes, the poisoning of the Harper herd, and the cynical plan to burn the farm to the ground. The faces of the officials at the table turned a sickly shade of gray, matching the silver of their cutlery. Jolene stood like a statue, her gaze pinned to the Zenith representative who sat 3 chairs down. His smug expression had evaporated, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror, as his own words condemned him before the entire committee. The doors at the back of the hall swung open again, but this time it was a swarm of reporters, their cameras flashing like a summer storm. The light was blinding, reflecting off the crystal and the terrified faces of the corrupt. Jolene turned toward the lenses and began to speak, her voice calm and terrifyingly precise. She recited names, dates, and the specific amounts of the bribes that had changed hands in back-office deals. She detailed the locations of the meetings where the destruction of the county's independent farmers had been orchestrated. The journalists' pens flew across their pads as they recorded the names of the men sitting at that very table. Jolene watched the chairman's hands shake as the cameras turned the private dinner into a public execution of the Zenith Empire. The lead judge stood up, pushing his plate away as if the food had suddenly turned to ash. He reached for the podium microphone, his voice vibrating with a cold, righteous anger. Looking directly into the main television camera, he announced that the earlier results were void, citing the evidence of criminal conspiracy. He issued an immediate order to seize Zenith AgCorp's local records and freeze their assets pending a state investigation. Jolene saw the fair's director try to slip the grant check into his pocket, but the judge's gaze stopped him cold. He ordered security to seal the exits until federal marshals could arrive, and Jolene watched in silence as the corporate giant began to collapse under the weight of its own greed. Jolene reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and pulled out a crumpled blue folder she had managed to save from her truck. She spread her evidence across the table for the press to see. Photos of the sabotaged irrigation lines, the jagged copper of the cut wires, and the lab reports showing the high concentrations of phosphide in Bessie's blood. She pointed to the handwritten logs in her notebook, showing how the appearance of the black SUVs always preceded a new disaster on her land. The papers were passed from hand to hand, the rustle of the pages the only sound in the room. Jolene felt a physical weight lifting from her chest. The truth, gathered in the dark hours of her despair, was finally doing the work it was meant to do. The Zenith representative suddenly bolted from his seat, knocking over a chair in his haste to reach the service exit. His expensive shoes skidded on the polished floor, but he didn't make it 5 feet before 2 massive security guards in blue uniforms blocked his path. He tried to duck under their arms, but a heavy hand slammed onto his shoulder, pinning him against the wall. Jolene heard the sharp, double click of handcuffs being ratcheted tight. The man who had tried to buy her life now hung his head, his face hidden from the flashing cameras as he was led out of the hall. Jolene watched him go, her expression unreadable. A woman who had seen the predator finally caught in its own trap. The chairman of the committee, his face still pale, reached into a small security safe and pulled out a fresh certificate embossed with gold foil. He wrote Jolene's name in a steady, elegant hand and pressed the state's heavy seal into the paper. When he handed the document to her, the weight of the paper felt like a bar of solid gold. She looked at the check attached to the grant. The amount was more than enough to pay off the bank in full and replace every piece of equipment Zenith had destroyed. Jolene clutched the paper to her chest, her fingers finally still. The grant that was supposed to be her eulogy had become the foundation of her children's future. Jolene's old pickup rattled into Pike County, kicking up a familiar cloud of red dust as she turned onto her road. A crowd had gathered at the Harper gates. She saw the same bailiff who had taped her door now, using a pocket knife to scrape the yellow plastic from the frame. His movements hurried as he tried to undo the damage. Neighbors who had previously hidden behind their curtains were now standing in the road, cheering and waving as she passed. She saw the property of the bank tape being tossed into a ditch like common trash. The house seemed to stand taller in the light of the setting sun, and for the first time in a month, Jolene took a breath that didn't taste like dust or fear. Frank killed the engine of his tractor right at her fence line and jumped down, a heavy coil of new copper wire over his shoulder. Behind him, a line of neighboring trucks and tractors stretched down the road. The men began to unload sacks of premium grain and clean water tanks, setting them in neat rows by the barn. Frank walked up to Jolene, pulling off his cap and offering a hand that held a set of brand new tools for the pump. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes was a plea for a fresh start. Jolene nodded, accepting the tools, and the yard was suddenly filled with the sounds of hammers and saws as the farmers of the county began to rebuild what they had allowed to be broken. Jolene stood on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around Benjamin and Emily. The children were laughing, their faces turned up to the sky as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The air was suddenly sharp with the scent of ozone and wet earth. A massive roll of thunder shook the house, and then the sky simply opened up, a solid wall of water crashing down onto the parched land. The rain washed the red dust from the porch rails and filled the cracks in the pastures. Jolene tilted her head back, letting the cold water soak her skin and wash away the grime of the last 2 weeks. The farm was coming back to life. The sound of the rain on the tin roof, a steady, rhythmic promise of hope.